My mother-in-law accused me of cheating on my husband because our baby was dark-skinned. I didn't cheat. The day my daughter was born should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. It was the culmination of 9 long months of waiting, of excitement and anticipation, and of imagining what our little girl would look like. I thought I was ready for anything, but what I didn't anticipate was that the very first day of my daughter's life would also be the start of a deep fracture in my relationship with my mother-in-law. I've always been aware of my unique background. I'm half native, but if you saw me, you'd never guess it. I take after my father, who is Jewish, with pale skin and dark hair, whereas my mother has the rich, deep skin tone of our native heritage. The first thing everyone says when they meet me is how much I look like my dad, with not much physical resemblance to my mother. I inherited his lighter complexion, much to my mother's amusement, and it always felt like one of those quirks of genetics that everyone chalked up to a mystery of biology. While I never fully looked like both of my parents, I never questioned where I came from. Then there's my husband. His family's complexion could only be described as lily white. Blonde hair, blue eyes, skin so pale he burns after a few minutes in the sun without protection. He's the very definition of fair, a contrast to my own darker hair and eyes. Even with our differences, it never really crossed my mind that there could be any issues when it came time to start our own family. Genetics are funny that way, you never know what you'll get. That's the beautiful mystery of it. When the day came for me to give birth, I was beyond exhausted, a mix of excitement and terror swirling in me. Our baby girl came into the world in the early hours of the morning. She was perfect. Dark hair, soft brown eyes that seemed to peer up at me with a knowing gaze, and, just like my mother, she had a beautifully deep skin tone. She looked so much like my mother that it warmed my heart. As I lay there, my body still aching from the effort of labor, everyone in the room was abuzz, cooing over her. I was tired but happy, watching my husband hold our daughter with awe in his eyes. He didn't care what color her skin was, she was our child. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, that no matter what, we had made something beautiful together. But then, Martha, my mother-in-law, decided to break the moment. She had been hovering, watching, and then, out of nowhere, she dropped a bombshell. "She doesn't look like husband," Martha said, her voice thick with implication. I blinked, trying to process her words. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart rate starting to pick up. I was tired, vulnerable, and her tone had already set me on edge. "I don't mean to be impolite," she said, but there was nothing polite about the suspicion in her voice. "But she doesn't look like husband. Does she actually belong to him?" It took me a moment to register what she was saying. She was implying, no, outright accusing, me of cheating. I could feel the rage boiling inside me, and if I hadn't been so weak from childbirth, I would have jumped out of that bed and told her exactly where she could shove her accusation. But I didn't get the chance. The nurse, bless her heart, stepped in before I could say anything and swiftly kicked Martha out of the room. For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it, that the nurse had put her in her place and we could all move on. But apparently, Martha had no intention of leaving things alone. A couple of hours later, I woke up to find her standing over my bed again. My heart sank as I saw the look on her face. She hadn't dropped it. Not even close. Before I could say anything, she unleashed a barrage of insulting, accusatory questions. "Is daughter really his?" she demanded. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Did you sleep with someone else?" The words hit me like a slap to the face. I felt my blood boiling under my skin, my pulse racing in my ears. The audacity of her to ask me such vile questions on what should have been one of the most sacred days of my life. And then the final blow. "Are you sure she's his?" I could barely speak, my mouth dry and my body too exhausted to fight. How could she ask me such a thing? How could she accuse me, standing over my bed as if she had the right to judge me, to cast doubt on the legitimacy of my child? It wasn't just the accusation that hurt, it was the fact that she could even think, for a second, that I wasn't loyal to her son. I had loved him with every fiber of my being, and we had been through so much together. And here she was, in the most fragile, intimate moment of my life, poisoning it with her baseless suspicions. I wanted to scream, to throw her out myself, but all I could do was lie there, my voice lost in a sea of anger and disbelief. Thankfully, my husband arrived just in time to witness the tail end of her tirade. He saw the look on my face, pale and drained from the ordeal, and immediately told his mother to leave. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his mind. I could see the anger flash in his eyes, and for once, Martha didn't fight back. She left without much fuss, but not before getting in one last parting shot. She told him that he needed to get a DNA test to prove that our daughter was actually his, as if the very essence of her being wasn't proof enough. As if the rare blood type she had inherited from my husband wasn't already a sign of the life we had created together. Our daughter carried the same blood type as him, an extremely rare one, and that fact alone should have silenced any doubts. But not for Martha. She clung to her ridiculous theory as if her life depended on it, refusing to see the obvious. I wanted to break down, to cry and scream and let out all the hurt and anger that had built up inside me in those first few hours of my daughter's life. But I didn't. I had to stay strong for my baby, for my family. I wouldn't let Martha's poison ruin what was supposed to be the most beautiful moment of my life. Less than an hour later, my own mother arrived. She burst into the hospital room with the kind of energy that only my mom could muster, her face lighting up when she saw her grandbaby for the first time. The pride and joy on her face were palpable as she rushed over to see the little one who looked so much like her. And then she saw Martha sitting in the corner, still sulking, and it was as if the air in the room changed. My mother didn't miss a beat. She strode right over to her, practically brimming with protective fury. "Martha," my mother said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm, "I'm here to see my granddaughter." I watched as Martha's face paled, her confidence visibly shaken in the presence of my mom's quiet authority. It was clear that Martha hadn't anticipated the confrontation, hadn't expected my mother to show up so soon or to be so unapologetically proud of our baby's heritage. In that moment, it was as if every insult, every doubt Martha had cast, was laid bare in front of the one person who would never let her get away with it. For a brief, satisfying moment, I saw Martha's composure crumble. She looked as if she had been caught red-handed, guilty of her pettiness, her ugliness. And as she hurriedly gathered her things and made a hasty exit, I felt a strange sense of victory. Not because Martha had been silenced, though that was a relief, but because my mother's presence, her unwavering pride in her grandchild, had restored a sense of balance. I wasn't alone in this. I had family too, and we were stronger than any toxic doubts Martha could throw our way. After Martha left, my mother took my hand and smiled, the warmth of her love washing over me like a balm. "Don't worry," she said softly. "She's perfect. You're perfect. And nothing anyone says will ever change that." In that moment, I knew she was right. It didn't matter what Martha thought. It didn't matter what she said. Our daughter was beautiful, loved, and undeniably ours. And no amount of doubt, no matter how loud or insidious, could ever take that away from us. The storm that Martha had brought into the room had passed. Now, it was just me, my mother, my husband, and our beautiful daughter. And that was all I needed. After Martha scurried out of the room, tail between her legs, the air felt lighter. It was as if a dark cloud that had hung over us since our daughter's birth had finally lifted. I could breathe again. My mother sat next to me, gently cradling my newborn in her arms, and in that moment, everything felt right. I was home, surrounded by love, the kind of unconditional love that didn't come with accusations or suspicion, but with pride and support. My mom looked down at my daughter, her dark skin glowing against the soft light of the hospital room, her tiny fingers wrapped around my mother's thumb. She smiled, and I could see the generations reflected in her eyes, the history of our family carried forward in the delicate features of my little girl. "She's got your spirit," my mother said quietly, her eyes full of warmth. "You can already tell. She's strong. Just like her mama." It was a simple statement, but the way she said it brought tears to my eyes. In the chaos of giving birth, in the midst of Martha's cruel accusations, I hadn't really allowed myself to feel everything. I hadn't let myself process the enormity of what had just happened. But sitting there, with my mother by my side and my daughter nestled against her chest, I realized the depth of what we'd created. This little girl was part of me, part of my husband, part of a lineage that stretched back through time. She was the living embodiment of all our hopes and dreams, and nothing Martha said could change that. I wiped a tear from my cheek, grateful that my mother had shown up when she did. It wasn't just her presence that comforted me, it was her unwavering certainty. She never questioned my love for my husband or the bond one had with my daughter. She saw what mattered, the love and the strength that carried through us, and dismissed the rest as the nonsense it was. Meanwhile, my husband, who had been watching quietly from the corner, came to sit beside me. He was still shaken from his mother's earlier outburst, but I could see the love in his eyes. He wasn't Martha. He didn't harbor any doubts or suspicions. He reached for my hand, holding it tightly, as if to reassure me that, despite everything, we were in this together. "I'm sorry about my mom," he said softly, his voice tinged with guilt. "I don't know what's gotten into her." I shook my head, too tired to even entertain an apology for Martha's behavior. "It's not your fault," I replied, squeezing his hand. "You know the truth, and I know the truth. That's all that matters." He nodded, glancing at our daughter with that same awe he'd had the first time he held her. "She's so beautiful," he murmured, his voice filled with a wonder that made my heart swell. I don't know how anyone could think otherwise. For a long while, we sat in silence, just the three of us, soaking in the enormity of this new chapter in our lives. The hospital sounds faded into the background, and all I could hear was the soft, rhythmic breathing of our daughter, the rise and fall of her tiny chest as she drifted off to sleep. But as the hours passed, my mind couldn't help but wander back to Martha's ugly words. The questions she had thrown at me, the accusations she had hurled, lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. I knew deep down that her suspicions were baseless, rooted in ignorance and fear. But that didn't stop the sting. How could someone look at a child, our child, and immediately jump to such hateful conclusions? How could she, of all people, not understand that children don't come with an instruction manual on how to look exactly like their parents? I thought about my own childhood, how I had grown up looking so different from my mother. People often assumed I was adopted or would make comments about how unusual it was for me to look so much like my Jewish father. But my mother had never let those comments bother her. She had always smiled, proud of the unique way our family presented itself to the world. She understood that family wasn't about surface appearances. It was about love, loyalty, and the bonds that couldn't be explained by DNA or skin color alone. And now, here I was, being forced to defend those same bonds against someone who should have been our biggest supporter, my mother-in-law. The weight of that realization hit me hard. Martha's accusations weren't just an attack on me, they were an attack on our family, on the very foundation of what we had built together, and I wasn't sure how to navigate that. A few days later, we brought our daughter home from the hospital. As much as I wanted to leave the drama of Martha's accusations behind, I knew that wasn't going to happen. My husband and I had barely walked through the front door when the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and saw it was Martha. I sighed, already bracing myself for whatever nonsense she was about to throw at me. My husband picked up the phone, and I could hear her voice, shrill and agitated on the other end. "Did you do the DNA test yet?" she demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. My husband's face tightened with frustration, and I could tell he was trying to stay calm for my sake. "Mom, we've been home for 5 minutes," he replied, his voice strained. "We haven't done anything but settle in." "Well, you should," Martha continued, her tone accusatory. "You need to know for sure." My husband looked at me, his eyes filled with apology. He hated this as much as I did. "We don't need a test, Mom. Our daughter is mine. End of story." But Martha wouldn't let it go. "How can you be so sure? She doesn't look anything like you. You have to be certain." I wanted to snatch the phone out of his hand and scream at her, to tell her to shut up and leave us alone, that her opinions didn't matter. But I stayed silent, letting my husband handle it. He was firm with her, standing his ground, telling her once again that we weren't entertaining her ridiculous demands. After he hung up, he turned to me, his face tight with anger. "I don't know what her problem is," he said quietly, shaking his head. "She's never been like this before." I nodded, trying to push down the frustration that was bubbling up inside me. "She's fixated on it," I said. "I don't know what to do to make her stop." We tried to move past it, to focus on our new life as parents. But Martha didn't make that easy. She kept calling, kept texting, kept pushing for that DNA test. It was exhausting. My husband did his best to shield me from it, but every time she called, I could see the tension building in him, the toll it was taking on both of us. Finally, after weeks of relentless pressure from his mother, my husband did something I hadn't expected. He ordered the DNA test. When he told me, I was furious. Not because I was afraid of the results, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that our daughter was his, but because I didn't want to give Martha the satisfaction. She didn't deserve to have her suspicions validated with a test. Our daughter's existence, her presence in our lives, should have been enough, but my husband was tired. He was tired of the accusations, tired of the constant barrage of doubt from his own mother. And as much as I hated the idea of the test, I understood why he did it. He needed to put an end to this. He needed to show his mother, once and for all, that she was wrong. The day the results came in, I could feel the tension in the air. My husband opened the email with shaking hands, and as he read the results, a wave of relief washed over him. He turned to me, a small smile playing on his lips. 99.99% match, he said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. I felt a surge of anger and relief at the same time. I had known all along that the results would come back this way, but part of me still hated that we had been forced to go through with it. I hated that Martha had cast this shadow over what should have been one of the happiest times in our lives. But at least now, we could put it to rest. At least now, we had the proof she had so desperately demanded. When my husband called his mother to tell her the results, I could hear her stunned silence on the other end of the line. She had no comeback, no snide remark. She couldn't deny the truth any longer. "She's my daughter, Mom," my husband said firmly. "She always was. Now you need to accept that and let it go." Martha sputtered something about being concerned, about wanting to be sure, but the wind had been knocked out of her sails. She had lost this battle. And we weren't going to give her the chance to fight it again. After that call, things changed. My husband and I decided that we needed space, from Martha, from her toxic accusations, from the damage she had tried to inflict on our family. We limited contact, only allowing her to visit when we felt it was right. We set boundaries, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Our daughter thrived, growing more beautiful by the day. She had my mother's strength, my husband's kindness, and a spirit all her own. And as I watched her grow, I knew that we had made the right choice in distancing ourselves from Martha's negativity. We had created a life that was filled with love, with family, with the kind of pride that comes from knowing where you come from, and no one, not even Martha, could take that from us. In the end, I realized that this journey wasn't just about proving Martha wrong. It was about standing firm in the knowledge of who we were, of the family we had built, and of the love that transcended any doubt or accusation. Martha's words had hurt, but they hadn't broken us. We were stronger than that. We were stronger together, and that, more than anything, was the legacy I wanted to pass down to my daughter. As the months passed, the distance we placed between ourselves and Martha became a form of protection, an invisible barrier that allowed us to finally enjoy the life we were building. Without the constant shadow of her accusations hanging over us, I began to feel lighter, more at peace. Our home was filled with the sounds of laughter, late-night feedings, and the gentle coos of our daughter as she discovered the world. It was a kind of peace I hadn't felt in so long, and I soaked in every moment. My mother visited often, her presence always a warm and steady force in my life. She adored her granddaughter, and every time she held her, it was like she was holding a piece of our history, our heritage, in her arms. My daughter had inherited so much of her skin, her strength, her gentle but fierce spirit. It was as if she had brought a part of my mother's ancestors back into our present, and I felt proud, deeply connected to the generations that came before me. I often thought about the irony of it all, how Martha had accused me, had doubted the very essence of my daughter, while my own mother had celebrated every single feature, every trait that made her unique. My mom's joy over our daughter's dark skin had been the exact opposite of Martha's reaction, and it reminded me of the deep roots I came from, roots that Martha would never fully understand. But the thing that mattered most to me, more than Martha's judgments or anyone else's, was the love between my husband and me. In those quiet moments, when we would sit together with our daughter between us, it felt like we had weathered the storm. My husband's unwavering support had carried me through the darkest moments, and I knew that he had faced his own struggles, torn between the love for his mother and the life we were building. But he had chosen us. He had chosen our family, our daughter, and for that, I loved him more deeply than I ever had before. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, our daughter asleep in his arms, he looked over at me with a soft, thoughtful expression. "I wish it hadn't come to that," he said quietly, his fingers gently stroking our daughter's dark curls. "I wish my mom could have just accepted her from the start." I sighed, leaning my head against his shoulder. "I know. But she can't change what is. Our daughter is perfect, just the way she is." He nodded, his eyes focused on the tiny face resting peacefully in his arms. "I know. And she is. She's more than perfect." I smiled, feeling the warmth of his words wrap around me. "We're going to make sure she knows that, every single day." He looked at me then, his eyes full of the same love and determination I had seen the day we first held our daughter. "We will. And she's never going to doubt where she comes from or who she is. We'll make sure of that." In that moment, I knew we were on the right path. It wasn't just about moving past Martha's hurtful words, it was about creating a space where our daughter would always feel loved, where she would grow up knowing that her heritage, her uniqueness, and the love that created her were all things to be proud of. And as I watched my husband cradle our daughter, I realized that we had done exactly what we had set out to do. We had built a family, one rooted in love, resilience, and the quiet strength of those who came before us. Our daughter would grow up knowing that, no matter what anyone said, she was born of love and history, and nothing, not even Martha's doubt, could ever change that. That night, as I tucked my daughter into her crib, I kissed her forehead softly and whispered, "You are loved. You are enough. You are everything." And as I turned out the lights, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, our family would stand strong. We had already survived the worst, and together, we would face whatever came next with the same love and strength that had gotten us this far. For now, the future felt bright, and in that quiet moment, with the soft hum of the baby monitor in the background, I let myself fully embrace the peace that had finally found its way back into our lives. This was the family I had dreamed of, and this was only the beginning. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment and follow for more stories.